are a major security issue across the country. They are the source of majority of violent crimes in the nation. So says Joanna Callen, crime, security, and justice researcher at the Caribbean Policy Research Institute. The JCF said there were approximately 381 gangs across the country. These gangs are classified in 3 categories.
JCF uses a classification system where you have the first generation gangs. These tend to be more loosely organized groups that tend to operate in a smaller territory. There is no form of distinct leadership per se, and they're out to prove themselves just because they're kind of the new kid on the block, right? And then you have the second generation gangs where these gangs have been around a bit longer, and so there's a more cohesive unification of the group, and there's a more distinct leadership, hierarchy, there's some structure in place, and they tend to be more goal-oriented in what they're doing. Now, there are also third-generation gangs, but as it stands right now, JCF doesn't believe that any third-generation gangs exist. Now, an example of a third-generation gang that existed several years ago would have been the Shower Posse, which was an extremely well-organized, large, distinctive operation. At one point, the Klansman was also that kind of third-generation gang, but because of the intra-gang warfare that took place within the gangsman between the Tesha Miller faction and the Andre Blackman faction, we've kind of seen it disintegrate, so it's not as cohesive as it once was or well-organized.
Ms. Callen underscored the point that violent crimes by gangs can be a real problem in Kingston and other parts of the country. They represent a common and significant threat to many communities.
Especially where there is an indiscriminate level of violence that doesn't, as I mentioned, it doesn't just target the gangsters themselves. It spreads across to innocent bystanders who may not necessarily be involved in gang-related activities. But just because a community member, somebody comes from a specific community, then they'll end up being targeted. If it is that issue or the issue of gangs is not addressed in a manner where it curtails their inclination towards indiscriminate acts of violence, then it literally means that at any given time, anybody is going to be a victim in our society.
The researcher also pointed out that Jamaica is ranked the second most homicidal country in Latin America and Caribbean region. Ms. Callen says violence affects the country's GDP in several ways.
The sheer cost that it takes for the hospitals when they're dealing with these injuries is a burden to the healthcare system. One treatment for a single person can run as high as in the hundreds of thousands. It means that once we have so many incidences of violence coming in to our accident and emergency or ERs in the hospitals, it means that the staff is going to be more pressured to deal with so many cases. It means that the medicine, the blood, the equipment, it all costs money to deal with this. Then there is the possible loss of work, which translates into loss of productivity. If these people aren't able to work because of the severity of their injuries, then it is a loss of productivity, which contributes to our GDP. And the main victims in the homicide rate in Jamaica are males between 15 and 35 years old. We're wiping out an entire group of potential earners. If somebody is incapable, if they're the primary breadwinner for their family, and especially if they're an innocent victim in the spate of violence, you're going to find where if this person is a breadwinner, then it affects the contribution of the household, to the economy. Then again, you also have the cost that the government has because we have such a high violence rate and crime rate. The government now has to expend an enormous amount of resources to address the issue. And these are resources that could have gone into other sectors to otherwise boost and assist productivity in the country.
In January 2018, Due to rampant violence and murders, the government of Jamaica declared states of emergency, SOE, and zones of special operations, ZOZOs, for several parishes, including the Kingston metropolitan area and the parish of St. James. The research conducted by the Caribbean Policy Research Institute, CAPRI, Guns Out, the Splintering of Jamaica's Gangs, will be launched at the Terra Nova Hotel in Kingston on Wednesday, March 4, 2020. Reporting for the news on PBCJ, I am Marlon Samuels.
Welcome to the launch of the fourth and final report under the Collaborating to Transform Citizen Security Yard project, which started in May 2017 and ends this month. We are indeed grateful to the Government of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, which provided funding through the Department of International Development. Some persons here would have joined us at the launch of From Force to Service, Transforming the Jamaican Police, Zero Murders, Searching for Lessons from 2 decades of anti-violence interventions in Augustown, and Scamming, Gangs, and Violence in Montego Bay. And we are delighted to have you back here this evening, along with other invitees, for Guns Out, the Splintering of Jamaica's Violent Gangs. To lead the discussion, we have brought together Mr. Jeremy Taylor, QC, Senior Deputy Director of Public Prosecutions, Major General Anthony Anderson, Commissioner of Police, and Ms. Kelly Magnus, Jamaica Country Lead, Fight for Peace, Jamaica. The discussion will entail the presentation of the research findings by Ms. Joella Callan, researcher at CAPRI, followed by a brief presentation by our panelists, as well as questions and answers. This evening's event will be moderated by Dr. Damian King, CAPRI's Executive Director. I am Nicole Walker, Director of Programs at CAPRI. To facilitate this evening's discussion, we'll be using an application called Slido. And those of you who have been to our previous events would have been familiar with the Slido application. The instructions to use the tool are on the back of the program, and we invite you to go to slido.com on your devices and connect to the Wi-Fi, slido.com. Okay. If it's not on your program, I will give you the instructions now. So please, okay, it's on the screen. So slido.com, connect to the Wi-Fi. The network name is Terra Nova Hotel -Pavilion. And the password is Terra Nova, one word, capital T, common O. Sorry, common N. One word, Terra Nova. And the event code is CAPRI. So once you're on the page, you can do two things. You can post a question, as well as vote on other person's questions. We ask that you indicate who is posting the question, as we'd like you to actually pose the question yourself. So if you're comfortable with it, we ask that you identify yourself when you post a question. If you have any challenges using Slido, please ask a member of the CAPRI team for assistance. I will now invite Mr. David Osborne, Country Representative for DFID, to bring opening remarks.
Good evening, everyone. It's getting quite nice. We've had a few of these events, and I see a lot of familiar faces, so I think that bodes well for having a really rich discussion later. So thank you very much, CAPRI, for offering us the opportunity to bring some remarks. The UK recognises that crime and violence is arguably Jamaica's primary development challenge at this point in time. And we've worked consistently and closely over many years with the Jamaican people and government to support efforts to tackle this epidemic. Unfortunately, as proven both in Jamaica and worldwide, violence is a truly complex problem and immensely difficult to resolve. As such, it's an issue that demands really informed action, and we recognize that timely, high-quality research, data, and evidence on violence, both its causes and solutions, is central to ensuring we have a sustainable solution. We're therefore providing significant support on that front. This includes support for Jamaica's Excellent Violence Prevention Alliance, who are working with your government to pioneer the use of medical data for understanding levels and types of violence and to guide responses. We're very soon to announce a new partnership that we are supporting between the Ministry of National Security and the University of Toronto for policy-related research on security issues. And it includes support for this series of papers from CAPRI, designed to dig into the detail and evidence and enable informed recommendations for national policy, legislation, and action. This report by CAPRI that we're going to discuss today contains some fascinating analysis on recent changes in gang activity and patterns of violence, particularly in response to suppression activity. It contains persuasive arguments for certain actions, such as well-evidenced, transparent social interventions and mainstream financial investigations, supported by tools such as unexplained wealth legislation. Understandably, given the complexity, severity, and importance of the situation, this analysis might be contested, and the recommendations are likely to prompt debate. And that's good. We look forward tonight to hearing that discussion and the esteemed Jamaican panel in the firm belief that informed evidence debate can only help us identify and deliver strategies and interventions that work. Thank you very much.
G-City, no pretty. Kill and collect, smoke and forget. Self-employed with a rifle and a handgun. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a motto of the extremely violent Salt Spring, St. James-based G-City gang. It characterizes Jamaica's most pressing problem, not crime per se, but the virulent violence produced and carried out by the gangs which plague our country. Last year, Jamaica was ranked as the second most homicidal country in the Latin America and the Caribbean. To put things in perspective for you, the global homicide average is 6 per 100,000. Jamaica's was 47 per 100,000. No one in this room is here because of burglaries. No one is here because Jamaica is spending billions of dollars for car thefts. The problem is murder, the rates of murder, which is the ultimate act of violence. This is why we are here. One might even say that Jamaica does not have a crime problem. We have a violence problem. Most of our homicides stem from gang-related violence. Between 2008 and 2018, gang-related murders accounted for some 56% of all murders in Jamaica, with a high in 2013 of 78%. Now, a wholly suppressive strategy can have the unintentional consequence of splintering gangs. We saw this with the May 2010 West Kingston operation, which dislodged the most established organized crime entity in Jamaica, the Shower Posse. And this was followed by an intensive crackdown targeting gang leaders across the island. Jamaica's murder rate fell from 62 per 100,000 in 2009 to 36 per 100,000 in 2014, which was our lowest murder rate for the decade. Now, in 2010, JCF counted some 191 gangs. In 2018, they counted some 381. Now, if you look at the trend, there has been a steady increase in the number of gangs, with a very sharp rise in 2016. But adding in the murder rate, as you can see, when murders was going down between 2010 and 2014, the number of gangs was actually slowly increasing. The splintering and conflict resulting from indiscriminate violence, not only towards gang members, whether they're in other gangs or in their own gangs, but towards the family of gang members, suspected informers, possible witnesses, and anyone who happens to be caught in the crossfire. Last December, gunmen went into Kitson Town, St. Catherine, for a single individual, a peaceful rural farming community that had never experienced any violent incidents prior. They opened fire on a bar and a shop, and in the process, 8 people were shot, 4 of which died. Now, there's a transnational dimension to this, ladies and gentlemen. Guns are a critical aspect of Jamaica's gang problem because majority of murders are committed with guns. Between 2010 and 2018, 76% of all murders was committed using guns. 97% of all gang murders is committed using guns. Our gangs are well armed and able to virtually grow currency to purchase new high-powered weapons. And criminals, whether they belong to a gang or not, use marijuana to buy weapons and cocaine, which fund the violence. Jamaica's porous borders, where we have some 145 unofficial ports, facilitates the importation of these guns. So what is being done about it? Now, we know most of our violence stems from intergang violence, intragang violence, violence in the pursuit of material gain, violence against people who might be unrelated to the gang. So in 2017, the government began using ZOSAs as an approach meant to use the security forces to provide the state with breathing room by removing the presence of volatile gangs while other state actors entered the communities to implement social interventions. Social interventions that are meant to address the sociocultural and environmental factors that help drive people into these gangs. However, at this time, there's not sufficient evidence to evaluate what impact, if any, they're having. Now, going into 2018, we saw the implementation of states of emergencies. Utilizing the SOEs in some of the more volatile communities and parishes in an effort to curtail the gang violence. The heavy security presence is meant to discourage gang violence. But does it though? While SOEs may provide breathing room in the short term, they are not sustainable in the long term. Additionally, there is an unintentional side effect of gang displacement, where they will move to other communities or parishes, and again, further splintering the gangs. So there's also legislation. Over the years, there have been several pieces of legislation that the government has enacted to address the issue. There's the Anti-Gang Act, there's the Proceeds of Crime Act, and there's the Evidence Act. These are just examples. Now, despite our long-standing history with gangs, the first time that legislation was enacted in 2014 to directly address the issue. When lottery scamming started, it took the government 7 years to enact legislation. And lest we forget, the proceeds of scamming has bought guns which fuel the violence. Now, legislation, especially the Anti-Gang Act, is currently being used to bring entire gangs before the courts, rather than a single gang member on a predicated offense. This is what we've seen with the Uchense Wilson gang, and soon, with a significant number of the Klansman gang members. Removing entire groups of perpetrators is intended to reduce the inter-gang violence and violence in general. Unfortunately, several of these legislation contain gaps, which actually hinder the state's ability to use them as effectively as needed. We run into the pervasive problem of the time lag between when there's a need for legislation and the legislation actually being drafted, debated, and passed. Legislation, and indeed our entire criminal justice system, needs to be more proactive to the issue rather than reactive. Now, the government has also, in the last few years, increased the funding for national security, which is very much a necessity and very much warranted. The JCF is in need of modernization, which it's in the process of doing right now. The gangs have modernized their operation. they use technology, and they have access to better weapons. If we want a police organization capable of handling said gangs, the JCF modernization is a necessity. Equipping the JCF and the JDF with the capabilities to protect our porous borders from the illegal importation of these guns is a necessity. And not just equipping them, but ensuring that it's the right personnel. Now, there's also the strategy of social intervention. Some of the social interventions, and when we're talking about social interventions here, we're talking about it in the broadest possible sense. Any efforts to directly or indirectly change the conditions that correlate with or are thought to be the cause of the proliferation of gang violence. That is not an actual law enforcement initiative. Now, over the years, the government has attempted several social intervention programs. Some of these programs work in many fields with other actors, stakeholders, NGOs, community-based organizations. It works directly to address some of the basic elements of preventing youths from joining gangs, which is to strengthen the actual communities. There's a major flaw, however, with too many of the social interventions, both state and non-state, by the way. They are not conceptualized with a proper monitoring and evaluation system. There have been other social intervention programs that may struggle with other things, but they also have the issue of sustainability. And I say this because we didn't end up in our current situation last year or even 5 years ago. And as such, our violence situation, which is years in the making, needs social interventions that are sustainable in the long run and carefully monitored and evaluated. And so this brings us to the recommendations. Transparency and accountability for social interventions. The government should provide more transparency, around social interventions, how and why those social interventions have been selected, and how they're actually being measured. The state needs to be held more accountable, and particularly by civil society. The next recommendation is to increase the scope and depth of financial investigations. This is for all criminal activity at all levels and not only financial crimes. Pursue legislative change with regard to unexplained wealth orders to put the burden of proof on the owner of the suspected assets and to asset recovery incentive schemes having addressed any extant constitutional constraints. Empower, equip, and support the Financial Investigation Division, FID, to make it more effective and able to conduct investigations. proactively engage the judiciary and the police to ensure that they are aware of how and why financial investigations are critical. And also how they can be used to fight the gangs. Going after the proceeds of gangs or organized crime is a powerful disincentive and symbol. And it doesn't hurt to raise the revenue either. The third recommendation is to modify the threshold for electronically related evidence. In particular, the modification, the restrictions used around using electronically generated evidence. And this includes videos and witnesses testifying via video link. Then there's the further use of the plea bargain option. Make further and ongoing use of the plea bargain option with incarcerated or otherwise convicted potential witnesses. The fifth, focus on preventing violence. The recently established Violence Prevention Commission, given its mandate and membership, has the potential to put forward important evidence-based recommendations to deal specifically with the violence aspect of Jamaica's gang problem. In doing its work, the Commission should keep stakeholders and the general public engaged in its findings and proposals. The final recommendation is to engage the public on the bipartisan anti-crime consensus. This will actually pave the way for bipartisan agreement and policies and programs that will not be affected by changes in political administrations and will better ensure the continuity needed for policies to have that effect. The public's engagement with the process and the resulting consensus is important for accountability and buy-in, and should actively be sought and supported. One more thing. I'm going to leave you with a number. 19,348. This is the number of persons that was treated from January to December 2017 in public hospitals across Jamaica for intentional acts of violence. Thank you very much.
Gentlemen, I'm your moderator for the evening. I'd like to invite the panelists to please join me on stage. Crime, Jamaica's security problem, is complex. Many facets, many aspects to it. And one simplifies a complex problem at one's peril. But what we heard from Joanna is not to simplify the problem, but simply to try to extract a thread, an important thread that helps us to understand what it is we're observing on the surface. And that thread was that we need to focus on violence more than crime per se. That is to say that most often, it is not crime that is driving the violence. It is not in the perpetration of a robbery that the violence happens, but the other way around. that many acts of violence are not in the perpetration of some other crime. The problem is violence, and crimes result from that because violence is a crime. And a lot of the violence, most of the violence, is originating in gang activity. So we need to focus on the gangs. And the final takeaway is that the gang landscape is dynamic. It changes. So this gives us a perspective on how we are going to assess the strategies that we have pursued and that we are proposing to pursue. And that's what we're going to talk about this evening. We are going to, for our Q&A, we indicated at the start that we're going to be using a platform called Slido. So for those of you who came in after the announcement, you navigate on your phones to slido.com or sli.do, and the event code is CAPRI. And when you put that in, it will take you to the app, and you have two actions on the app. One is to post a question. We prefer if you identify yourself by name if you post a question. And the second action is to vote on questions posted by others so we can see which are the most popular questions. Just to get you on the app and get you accustomed to it, we're going to do a poll. So if you could go to your phones, log in, and we'd like to find out from everybody here if gang violence has ever touched your life directly. Has gang violence touched your life? Now, it's remarkable. It's remarkable that nearly a third of you has come in such close contact with gang violence. And that is one measure, a new measure of the scale of the problem that we are dealing with. Before we go to a broader discussion, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give us their take on the problem that we are here discussing so we can add some more perspective to it. I'm going to start by inviting Kelly Magnus, please. The panelists will have 5 minutes to make their presentations.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you to DFID and CAPRI for arranging this evening, and to Diana and Joanna for a very comprehensive report, and good evening to my fellow panelists. I'm going to use the brief time I have just to do two things. One, to explain Fight for Peace's perspective on how civil society organizations can contribute effectively to violence prevention, and two, in the context of that framework, to respond to the findings of the report. We are a global NGO that is explicitly focused on youth violence prevention. We've been doing this work for 20 years, starting in Maré, which is a favela in Rio de Janeiro, and moving to East London, where we have our second academy. The program that we've been running in Jamaica for the last 4 years is intended to replicate the academy experience, but using a distributed approach. So our work here involves coordinating a network of local partners to bring together to communities that would not have those programs, engagement activities for young people that can encourage them to either avoid or desist involvement in crime and violence. And we came here with that perspective. We refined it in partnership with the NGOs and ministries, departments, and agencies that we work with. And we've distilled our approach here to 4 key things. The first principle is holistic programming. We see in the spaces where we work a lot of single-strand interventions run by civil society organizations, and in large part, they don't work. So we cannot assume that every unattached youth is going to be attracted to welding or basket weaving or whatever the idea behind intervention is. What we do see working is where there is a rich mix of activities that meets the needs of each young person and the interests of a wide cross-section of young people. Young people in disenfranchised communities are no different than young people anywhere else. Their interests are varied, and so to try to engage them and to encourage them to counter the narratives that exist in their communities, we need sticky programming that meets those varied interests. The second key principle for us is collective action. We think it is difficult, if not impossible, for any one agency or NGO to deliver that rich array of programming. So what is working for us here is encouraging a mix of local partners, both state agencies and civil society organizations, to come together and co-deliver a program, each one doing the thing that they do best. So we have RISE that does brilliant work in personal development. We have an awesome array of combat sports federations that hook our kids to get through the door because they think they're coming to learn to fight. We've got Joytown that does parenting. We've got a whole host of partners, some more involved than others, but all co-delivering under a shared measurement framework and under a shared agenda, which is to reduce youth violence. The third key principle for us is that we have to understand how violence works and make sure that we have differentiated programs for youth at different risk levels. So the bulk of our program is open access, it's deterrence programming. Those kids are not involved in crime and violence, but they're affected by crime and violence. And at the secondary level, we have more focused programs with state agencies that are working with higher risk youth. At the tertiary level, we have co-designed a program with local partners to work with gang members and ex-incarcerated offenders, but we have not yet been able to deliver that because of funding. I'm hoping that tonight that might change. And then the fourth key area for us is having a reciprocal arrangement with policy. We believe that civil society activity needs to be informed by policy. Civil society does not set policy, that is the state's responsibility, but we are in many ways better placed to implement it. And we are also able to share what we learn from our underground work with policymakers and program designers so that better designed programs can be replicated and scaled. So that said, that's the framework from which I'm looking at the report. And the first point of feedback I want to make is that we need to be a little bit more cautious with our language when we're talking about social interventions because they're not homogeneous. And if we want to talk about their effectiveness, we have to be really careful that we evaluate that effectiveness based on what the objective of the intervention was. The report does a brilliant job at laying out the challenging social problems in these communities. And I just want to underscore the point that not every intervention in a community with a high level of violence was explicitly intended to either reduce the homicide rate or to reduce gang violence. There are other important social goals that those interventions are designed to address. And so we want to make sure that we're not comparing apples and oranges and that we really focus on evaluating interventions that were designed with the explicit intent to reduce the homicide rate in the short term. The challenge is that there are not enough of those for us to talk about. And we need to think about how we can facilitate more partnerships between civil society, the state, and security forces to make sure that the kinds of short-term interventions that can reduce the need, the willingness, and the ability for gang members to commit acts of violence are being implemented. The second key point I'd like to make is that we need to think about the way that we design suppressive measures. I think the report, again, does a brilliant job in underscoring the need for them. Civil society organizations cannot stop crime. That is the role of the police. But we want to make sure that suppressive measures are implemented in ways that do not worsen the problems when those suppressive measures end. States of emergency and zones of special operations cannot be permanent. And if they're not implemented in ways that are careful so that they don't weaken the social fabric within the communities, then we basically guarantee job security for the kinds of people who come in to do the follow-on interventions. In our work in Brazil, we have seen that where suppressive measures are successful, they are targeted, intelligence-driven, short-term, limited in number and duration, executed by highly trained personnel, and complemented with policing activities that build trust and long-term targeted social interventions. The third thing I wanted to flag in the report is that I think we need to make sure that we are combining interventions that address short-term goals with those that address the root causes that, again, are so brilliantly laid out in the report. addressing the vast array of social issues laid out in that report can't be the job of the police. I think we need to bring other state actors to the table, led by the security forces, but making sure that we are dealing with the underlying challenges that create the conditions for young people to join gangs. And then the last point that I'd like to make is that I think we need to ask more of the state. I think the state, with regard to civil society work, it needs to be more than catalyzing transparency. We need the state to play the leadership role in setting the policy directive, coordinating CSO actors, convening stakeholders, prioritizing the geographies that we work in, the cohorts that we work in, the kinds of interventions that are required, and creating the monitoring and evaluation framework under which all of these interventions optimally should operate. The report has talked about the splintering of Jamaica's violent gangs, and I think in closing I'll just say that we cannot meet this splintering if our responses are equally splintered. So I think the time is now for us to think about how we can marshal all the resources that we have from the state, from the security forces, and from civil society to create more effective and sustainable solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Magnus. Mr. Taylor. I mean, you can do it from your seat if you want, or you can come to the podium, your choice.
Good. To kind of remind me of work. All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me just begin with a disclaimer. What I am saying here is entirely my own opinion and not that of the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions, or neither that of Ms. Paula Llewellyn. To start out by speaking about criminal organizations, which is a term I will use, because if you read the statute, it contemplates an informally organized persons on street corners, contemplating corporations, companies involved in nefarious activities. And in my 5 minutes, I would like to say that basically we have been evolving ways how to combat the whole thing of criminal organizations and their activities. When I came to the DPP, I came there at a time, but long before Shower Posse was taken down, I came at a time when it was the Gideon Warriors up in Augustown. I don't know if anybody is old enough here to remember that infamous video of them in the bush, up in the hills of Gordontown, smoking the ganja and modeling with the guns and everything. And so I was there when the police and the DPP had put together a strategy in how to deal with them, and took down the leadership, Joel and them, down Kevin Tyndale, O.C. Richie Poo, and so on. So I remember from far back from before the events of the Christopher Michael Coke extradition. If what it has taught us is, and consistent with the theory of the report, is that nature and crime abhor a vacuum. So out of the end of Gideon Warriors, you came a splintering. You got things like Jungle 12 and Judgment Yard and so on. Other people rising to fill the vacuum of what was once a pervasive influence in the communities. That also has happened in West Kingston. With the end of the Shower Posse, you've had a splintering and a multiplicity of criminal organizations have arisen out of it. By the time 2014 came around, when the legislation was passed, and I remember doing a presentation to the police, and I entitled it Bugs, B-U-G-G-S, and I don't mean it to demean anybody, but at the time when I did it, the title was taken out of all the gangs I myself had been involved in prosecuting. B, standing for Buckner Gang, up in the hills of Clarendon. U, standing for Umbrella Gang, out in Portmore. G, standing for Gaza. The verdict had just come a month before the legislation came into being in 2014. Gully, I had dealt with some murders coming out of that side of Constant Spring, in which a certain notable individual's name was called up in a lot of those cases, but we didn't have admissible evidence. And S, Stone Crusher, from Montego Bay. So it's been a long time. And the methods that have evolved, at first we were using methods such as common law methods. How did we go after them? So with Gideon Warriors, we used the Firearms Act because we couldn't really get civilians, except for one case with Richie Poo, we really couldn't get civilians out against the Gideon Warriors. So we had to deal with the cases in which they had engaged the police. And so that was one way in which we did all those matters in the gun court. We used accessorial liability, that is secondary parties, aiding and abetting, counseling, procuring, and so on to get them. But what we were doing, we're actually prosecuting individuals and individual crimes and not the organizations. So since the Jerome Markland matter in St. Catherine, which we got the guilty plea, I think we finally have hit upon a template in which we have managed to turn a whole lot of intelligence which the police had on these criminal organizations. We have managed to find a way to translate a good amount of it into evidence. And we've managed to find a way, even including informal plea negotiations. So this is the way we have embarked on. And right now, I think, my personal opinion, it is proving to be very useful, especially in relation to the prosecution of the Kings Valley gang and the Uchense Wilson gang. In closing out, I'm going to say that the whole area of investigation and prosecution is very dynamic. We can't say that by next year or the next 2 years, we will still be using this method. We will have to evolve to fight it, and I'll give an illustration with it. I have heard the description of gangs as first generation, second generation, third generation, but my view, and I have not done the study, so I can't really criticize it, but I would like to know where the Uchense Wilson gang fits in, because for me, as a prosecutor of 20 years, I am seeing an evolution of a criminal organization which is no longer tied to territory, which is running itself like a corporation, which has a skills bank. And when they need particular skills, they go for that person. And because they are not tied to territory, they are very mobile. They hit 7 parishes that we know of. As far as I know, they could have hit the whole island. So this is the next phase of law enforcement, investigation, and prosecution that we are moving to. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Commissioner.
So thank you, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And thanks for that study. Thanks for your presentation on it, particularly your recommendations. I could add a few to it, but probably I'll come to that at some point in the presentation or in the question and answers. There are a number of things that came out of the presentation that I'll just comment on a few because we're only given 5 minutes to speak. But I'd agree with the findings that what we have is a violence problem more than a crime problem. And our violence far exceeds either our crime rates or our social conditions. And so what we're seeing is a spiral of violence. Now, we crossed the 1,000 homicides per year mark 22 years ago. For the last 15 years, we have not dipped below that. We have always been above it, and the closest was in 2014 when we had 1,005 homicides. It was the closest we ever came to the 1,000 homicide per year mark for 15 years. Now, over that period, and over probably the 22 years, there are a number of measures that have been taken. Some of them have been successful temporarily, and for one reason or another, they stop working, or they stop playing out, they stop being funded, or there's some aspect of it that ceases. Whether it's a change in policy, change in people, change in process, or an evolution of the gangs that we're looking at. But some change has caused it to stop working. Now, some of the times as well, we move from thing to thing without analyzing why it stopped. And it may be actually pretty effective, but just because of something on implementation, execution, or some funding arrangement, financing, it has fallen by the by. And so that's one of the things we have to consider. Now, from our perspective as law enforcement, we have, in response to gang activity, we have a number of responses. And the anchor of it, really, the key element of it from our perspective is our anti-gang activities. And that is actually getting the gang as an organization rather than as individual members or who have done particular offenses and trying to chase those offenses. Because what we have seen in the past, that leads to splintering. And it doesn't really rob the organization of its effectiveness, just of their leadership. And sometimes out of that leadership race comes a lot of violence and conflict as it tries to settle on new leadership. The issue of, and so that is the central part of it. Now around that, of course, is how we use science in our investigations, which we are using a lot more of that in recent times, and how the science becomes as best as possible the center of things around which we build eyewitness evidence and all of that. In highly violent gangs and situations with highly violent gangs, a lot of people are unwilling to come forward and say what they know and become witnesses. We actually have a witness protection program in Jamaica that has never lost anyone who has gone into the program. So I just say that out there for the record. We have never lost anyone. At the moment, we have, I think, probably 13 gangs and portions of gangs waiting in a lineup to go before the courts. Well, some are already there at different stages, and then we have more coming. And these are highly violent organizations. At the same time, when you are facing a 61 per 100,000 homicide rate, when the global average is 6, you have to intervene immediately to create suppression. So the two things. Firstly, and I'm going to stop here, a zone of special operations is really a development tool. It only clears enough space for development activities and these intervention activities to take place. That's why it's there. That's what the legislation lends itself to. A state of public emergency is really when you have a crisis in your country or you think you have a crisis. If you are 10 times the global average, you're probably in a crisis, even if you don't think so. Now, as you move that down and as you carry out these activities, so we've been at it for 22 years. So the question is, what's an appropriate length of time to keep something in place? And is it a function of time or is it a function of some condition that we have to arrive at? The second thing is that within the states of public emergency areas, not only does violence between gangs go down and violence on bystanders, but also the police-initiated violence goes down as well. And that has been a feature. Last thing, and the presenter, Joanna, she said in the beginning about, quoting some of the things from the gang that exists in Salt Spring. Good. Well, through a process of engagement with the police and social intervention with the police and a number of stakeholders in Salt Spring, that dynamic has changed significantly. And the relationships between that community and the police, this is somewhere we'd go in, heavily armed, 2 vehicles, everybody with rifles going into this area. And nowadays we have police officers traveling in their private car in uniform and people were waving at them. That's a change in Salt Spring. So we're using the conditions set by the state of public emergency to do a series of normal law enforcement activities to create the change and interventions and engagement with communities that when you have a very violent, strong gang in that community, you cannot engage in that way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. So a few common themes have already emerged from the presentation and from the comments that have been made. And one of those themes is a reiteration and reinforcement of the idea that not only are gangs the primary driver of the problem that we observe, but that the gang landscape is dynamic. It keeps changing. You cannot do a static analysis in 2015 and use that to inform your strategy in 2020. And in that context of a constantly shifting gang landscape, the first question that you have posed seems appropriate. That is part of that dynamism related to the prosperity, the relative prosperity of different geographic areas, different parishes. Does gang activity, apart from chasing just the most populated areas where it is going to be concentrated, does it also reflect chasing after where the prosperity is moving to? Is there evidence of that? Let me start with the Commissioner to see if he knows, and then John.
Okay, well, so there's a language, and we've had to, at the police, modify our language around a number of the things relating to gangs. For instance, gang migration was a thing. Mm-hmm. You had a gang operating in a particular area. They come under pressure. They move out of that area, and they go to largely to people who they knew in the rural parts of Jamaica to cool out. Or if they have support, if they're linked to another gang, then they would go in that other gang's territory to cool out. That has changed somewhat. And it's changed not just for a number of reasons. One is that the members, again, gang members are largely young people. They have access to communications, and as you were saying about increased access to money, they have access to transport. So we do a raid somewhere, and we ask, having held some people, we ask, where were you yesterday? Well, this is in, say, Seaview Gardens. Well, last night I was at a party in Montego Bay. The day before I was at a party down in St. Elizabeth. So they just go and come back. And when they go and move, they link with other people. So they're not migrating, they're just mobile. And they have the means to be mobile, they have the communications, and what you see in one place, you see in another. Those days in Jamaica where you can look at somebody and know that they're from country or from town, is changing. You don't know, because they have access to the same information, because they're on the same devices looking at what is happening around the world instantly. And that's impacting what we're doing. So as we develop new strategies, it has to take that into consideration.
Joanna, you have anything to add to that?
Sure. So, well, to first answer the direct question on Slido, the report did not look at that in the process of the research. And part of that reason stems from the fact that we started out looking at the statistics. Kingston and St. Andrew has the highest number of gangs. Justifiably so, because it probably has the highest population levels. In terms of prosperity, I personally do not think that the level of gang violence is always going to be associated with level of prosperity. If we go to Montego Bay, which one can argue that it's a fairly prosperous parish, lot of scamming and the level of violence. In 2017, St. James had the highest murder rate per capita. It has in numerous hotels, numerous business, and with the amount of money coming in from lot of scamming, it was prosperous. So the parish itself could be deemed as prosperous, but it still had an extremely high level of violence experienced there, right? And so, as the commissioner is saying, there's a fluidity in terms of the way that gangs are able to move from one parish to the next. the frequency with which they are, moving from one place to the next. And the reality is that regardless of prosperity or how developed a parish is, I think it comes down to the sociocultural norms that these groups that exist in these parishes have that drives the violence per se.
So it seems that we need to pursue the consensus that there needs to be a focus on the gangs. Venetia has a question related to the counter-gang team. Where's Venetia? Yes, can you get a microphone to Venetia, please?
I think I can project. Good evening. This is for Commissioner Anderson. Is it a fact that the JCF had a counter-gang team that was disbanded between 2015 and 2016? If this is so, in the face of rising gang formation, why would that be the case? And if so, what has replaced that counter-gang team?
So I'm not aware of the 2015-16 team, but we have a counter-gang investigative team that operates out of CETOC. Well, I probably won't mention who heads it up, but out of CETOC, Mr. Bailey's here, one of his, it works for him out of there, and their job is to focus on gangs. And most of these gang cases, working with the DPP, that's how we end up with them in custody.
Sandra Glasgow has a question that is related to the legislative changes that the presenter raised. Sandra, where are you?
Good evening, everybody. This question is for Jerome Taylor. What is your view of the fact of the lengthy lag between the required legislation, the drafting and enactment of legislation? I think our presenter pointed out the significant lag. And how can we be more proactive than reactive in coming up with legislation that is going to anticipate how gangs and how violence is perpetrated?
All right, that question sounds like it's designed to get me into problems. But I really don't have one single answer to that question. My answer is really twofold. One, somebody who works at the office of the DPP and thus a part of law enforcement, I wish Parliament moved much faster. Perhaps if they sat more than the Tuesday and Wednesday for the House of Representatives and the one day of the week, the Friday for the Senate, we would get legislation passed quicker. And perhaps if some things could come on the agenda, if it's not the IMF moving things along, things will perhaps come on the parliamentary agenda much faster. So I say that. At the same time, I have to say, legislation just does not drop out of the sky. There are things that we would like to see, but it will take time. The Parliamentary Council just doesn't come and draft that way. They have to deal with recommendations. So for now and then, the DPP may recommend, we suggest changing this provision in this act to this, or the police may recommend certain things. But because sometimes the changes may be far-reaching and fundamental, I cannot complain if Parliament decides to form a joint select committee to look at that and get the views of all stakeholders, especially when you are dealing with rights. And we are now in a new constitutional paradigm with the Charter of Rights of 2011. So I can't really complain with the consultative approach. I wish it would move faster, but I cannot complain about it. So that's why I say I can't give a single answer.
But sorry, Jerome, you will agree that
Microphone, please. Use the microphone.
Sorry. You will agree that 7 years is inordinately long.
All right, but that's that
I mean-
7 years was in relation to the Law Reform Fraudulent Transactions Act. Now, what was happening was that this was completely new legislation. So what has happened is that in the past, we've had legislation that you can use to build on, take provisions from others, and form. This was completely new. We've never had anything like this before. And so we had to study other models from other parts of the world. I remember the committee in our office looking, for example, at the Nigerian Penal Code, which had these 477 frauds or something like that, to look at it. And then we can't just abstract every evidential piece that we would like. We have to look, well, what is the law in Jamaica in relation to this? Would it have to be changed? Would we have to enact a completely new piece of legislation to go and deal with that aspect of evidence? So 7 years was long, yes, but I think based on what we have come up with, it was a considered piece of legislation.
Yeah, having said that, it still does seem, to Sandra's point, that 7 years is a long time. Doing worldwide research, which CAPRI does a fair bit of, should only take that long if you're actually sailing to the countries to look at their legislation. So I think the question still stands.
Well, I suggest then that CAPRI loan themselves out to Garden House.
Good point. Now, I don't want us to, having identified the important role of gangs, I don't want to shift too far away from that. But Kelly, in your presentation, you made a point which I think is intriguing in the context that we've been discussing Jamaica's security problem. We very often hear that, it is a problem for all of us. We all have a role. We need to approach the problem differently. We need to report. We need to cooperate. It's everybody's problem. And you challenge that to say that the state has a leading role. And to the extent that the state doesn't take on that leading role, we're not going to get very far. Could you just elaborate on that? Because I think it's a different voice on that issue from what we've been hearing.
Yeah, I think the challenge that we see, not just in regard to responses to gangs, but responses to violence in general, is that there is no central coordination. So initiatives are designed by well-intentioned NGOs or sometimes catalyzed by equally well-intentioned international development partners, or some initiatives are organic to communities, but there's nobody directing traffic. And so we talk about violence as a national problem, but it's not really a national problem. It is a problem in specific communities. And if you look at the top 10 communities in terms of homicide rate, certainly New Orleans and Kingston, there is a plethora of overlapping interventions, not all of which have clearly articulated monitoring and evaluation frameworks, many of which have competing, if not conflicting, objectives, all targeting the same population. In my team, we refer to it as T-shirt bingo. Like, if you're not careful, you go into the community and one day they're wearing your T-shirt, and the next day the same set of people are wearing somebody else's project's T-shirt. And I think if violence is a national security issue, and if we know the communities where the problem is the greatest, and we know the cohorts that are most in need of intervention, then I think the state has the opportunity and the responsibility to create the framework in which any social intervention that wants to operate in that space has to operate. We, in our network, use a framework called Collective Impact. It's worked very well for us, and it basically requires all partners to commit to a shared agenda. So whatever you're doing in your outside work, when we come together to work in this community, we are working on one thing, reducing the likelihood that this participant will become an active shooter. It requires everybody to commit to a shared measurement framework. We equip our partners with a common monitoring and evaluation tool. The most difficult part is committing to mutually reinforcing activities. So if you have two partners that are skilled in the same area, pick a lane. Everybody picks one thing and they focus on that one thing. And I think most important, Somebody has to get up and say, we're playing the role of the backbone organization. In our network, that's us. But I think what I'm arguing for is that because of this, the gravity of this issue, this is a role that the state should play.
Indeed. Now, you mentioned a point that was also raised in CAPRI's report, which is the absence, not absence, but certainly insufficient monitoring and evaluation. And in that regard, David M. has a question which actually is related to that. Where's David? Yes. Microphone. No.
Oh, excellent. My question, I guess maybe more to
Kelly, I think, should take it.
Kelly and maybe John, is we have these types of social interventions in Jamaica. And I was curious as to where else in the world has this worked, and maybe we could tack something else on it. You spoke about the monitoring and evaluation. Are you satisfied that we actually use any kind of relevant evaluation mechanisms for the social interventions we currently do or have planned on doing, especially in the description of the ZOZOs?
So I'll answer it in two ways. In terms of tertiary level interventions, the gang intervention projects that Fight for Peace has run in London and Rio have been rigorously self-evaluated and externally evaluated, and have had higher than 65% success in transforming active gang members into productive employment or into formal education. That is the project that we have designed a local iteration with the Peace Management Initiative and would like very much to implement it. In terms of the monitoring and evaluation of existing initiatives, I think the challenge is that the frameworks where they do exist, and many of the interventions do not have any monitoring and evaluation at all, those frameworks are internally designed. So it's a civil society organization that decides what it's going to monitor, or in some instances it may be in collaboration with the donor that is funding the project, that framework is developed, CSO to donor. But within the violence prevention space, there is no overarching monitoring and evaluation framework provided by the state to which civil society actors are required to adhere. So one area where there's potentially an example of how this could work is that the Ministry of Culture, Gender, Entertainment, and Sport has just created a national framework for monitoring and evaluation for sport, which looks at all of the areas that sport is meant to address, including sport for peace. And the intention is now to roll that out so that all sport federations and sport-based NGOs working in sport can now jointly provide data that can all bubble up to a national level. I think we need something like that in violence prevention. In some ways, it's work that is coming out of the community renewal program led by the Planning Institute, but there's still a ways away from that being universally accessible to all of the actors that are working in this space.
I'd like to get back to what seems to be, I referred to earlier as the consensus, and that is how we deal with the gangs. Here's a question here, Joanna. You mentioned that the gang landscape has evolved in the post-Dudus era. The audience wants you to elaborate on what are the qualitative ways in which gangs have changed in the post-Dudus era. Size, structure, organization.
So I've had some informal conversations with persons from some of these communities, and even the definition of what is classified as a first-generation gang. They're more loose, they're not as tightly knit, they're not necessarily goal-oriented, necessarily towards the pursuit of material gains. Now, what I found was that people are forming gangs to not necessarily form an organization per se, but a group of extremely loosely knit individuals who just kind of want to be the shatter in the area. Now, one of the things we saw specifically in West Kingston was that after the shower posse, after the coke was removed, there was a lot of violence down there because there was a race or fight to see who would be the next person in control or the next group in control. And based on my conversations with some individuals, informal conversations with individuals from several of those communities, we have 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old young men who are armed, not in school necessarily, and they're coming together to try and control that area. And then what you have is these very loose groups of individuals, not necessarily with a structure in place, that are vying for that power vacuum that was left in West Kingston. And so one of the things that, you looked at the graph, I looked at the numbers from JCF, where in 2010, we had 191 gangs. In 2018, we have 381. One of the things is that we have a very small group of virulent violence producers. These are not whole communities that are producing the violence. It's a small group of individuals who are coming together because they want to take up power vacuums that are there. We see the splintering, and then when you have scarce resources, you have so many gangs operating that resources become scarce. And then so they're vying for those resources. And the reality is that sometimes it splinters the gangs themselves because there's an argument as to who is getting the amount of resources that the gang has access to. We saw this quite a bit with scamming. A lot of the scamming gangs, there was a lot of intra-gang violence, not inter-gang violence necessarily, but intra-gang violence as to how to split the proceeds of scamming. And so I think the landscape has shifted in terms of the fact that we have a lot more armed groups of gangs that are vying to kind of prove themselves in these areas within which they exist, and not necessarily in a very cohesive, structured manner with the kind of leadership that we saw with Coke existing in West Kingston, per se.
Mr. Taylor, yes.
If I may just build on what Joanna was saying from my own observations as a prosecutor, and bearing in mind, I have done no empirical study, so I can't show any figures to you. But I've been at the DPP since 2004. When I came there, I had to start out in the gun court. So between 2004 and 2010, if I use West Kingston as an example, you hardly used to get cases out of Kingston West Division. It was a different kind of peace that was reigning in Kingston West. So you'd get mostly from St. Andrew South, out at Hunts Bay. But between 2004 and 2010, you'd hardly got from Kingston West. In the gun court, I'm speaking about, my observations. After the extradition of Mr. Coke, and after the brief lull that came there, my own observation is that Kingston West now is a significant contributor of cases to the gun court. That peace that used to reign there has come to an end, and you are getting all kinds of gun crimes committed there. Many of them, when you read the files and you speak to the investigators with a criminal organization element in the background of it. So to me, I have seen where the landscape has changed since the extradition of Christopher Michael Coke.
So CAPRI exists. The reason for CAPRI's existence is to bring research, knowledge, evidence to the determination of policy. And so the favorite kind of question that we get at a CAPRI forum is, how do you know? And in that regard, I'm sort of happy to invite Devon to ask his question. Devon? Do we have a Devon? Devon's question, which I would actually like to direct to the commissioner, since we are using police data. Devon's question is, how do you know that a killing is gang-related or not another factor?
So the attribution of the killing, sometimes the ballistics associated with the weapon. We see it used again and again in cases. Sometimes because we actually have the perpetrator in custody quite often. We just had a spate of successes in the Western Regional Gun Court around guns, using some scientific evidence, and so it clearly playing out as gang violence. Now, the thing is that a lot of gang violence is also interpersonal violence. So it's actually a reprisal for some other act and not for the commercial aspect of gang activities. It is there to deal with a case that happened before. We just had one recently where the initial event was in 2016 and they got back at the person in 2020, 4 years later. So yes, it's gangsters doing it, but it's also interpersonal. So as we look at how we address them, we have to understand that as well, which kind of lends itself more to that public health model that has been discussed over and over again with violence, because violence doesn't operate like crime. So even in your interventions, your crime interventions are not the same as your violence interventions. They have a different cast to it. But on another point, relating to something that was said earlier, more people have their own guns. There's no question about that. More individuals, gang leaders used to control the guns and they'd dole them out, rent them out, tell you who to do what to. That's not the case. As more people got money through scamming, through other activities, they have their own weapons. And people bring them in, they trade them. There's a business around the illegal gun trade. That is why we've been advocating for the Firearms Act to be amended in such a way that it reflects, and work is being done on it, to reflect our current circumstances. Most people wouldn't believe that there's no such offense as trafficking firearms. There's no such offense.
So we have an industry, a social industry, which is producing and maintaining gangs. And that is underlying the problems that we observe. We have observed as well from newspaper reports that this is now manifesting itself in schools, that the schools are part of the gang culture. The recommendations, one questioner is asking, don't speak to that aspect of it. But I'm going to direct the response, not to our research, but to Kelly, to see what is the kind of intervention you think that would work in the area of schools that could interrupt that, that recruitment pipeline.
I'll answer it in two ways. So we work very closely with the Peace Management Initiative, and they, as part of their community violence interruption activities, do a lot of work in school, both traditional conflict resolution, skill building, mediation activities, but also increasingly more trauma-based responses, trying to unpack the reasons that make young people susceptible to recruitment by gangs. The Fight for Peace also does some of that work as well. So one of the things that has been a really important part of our program is adding a psychosocial support team to the work that we do in the communities, because we realize that many of the existing interventions don't allow for that, to unpack some of the psychosocial challenges that young people are having that make them vulnerable. And so I think that is a big part of what has to happen within the school, just trying to provide more psychosocial resources. The second way I will answer is to go back to what I was saying earlier about marshalling the larger resources of the state to geographies where gang violence and violence in general is a problem. So one example is that we work in Denham Town, which is part of the zone of special operations. We know anecdotally and from our conversations with the security forces there that the high school there is a breeding ground for the gangs in the area. And yet there has been no large-scale effort at transforming the school educationally. So it's not, you know, it's not rocket science to look at the pass rate at Denham Town High. 1.7% of the graduating class from fifth form passes 5 or more CSEC subjects. 1.7% is 2 people. So if you look at the, and what I was mentioning earlier, is just looking at the basic social services that have to be reformed as part of any larger security intervention. So I think there's external resources that can come into school to provide psychosocial support and mediation services, but then there is also basic school transformation in schools that are positioned in communities with high levels of violence that has to be addressed simultaneously.
Can I make a comment on that, David?
Yes, Commissioner.
So on the school, there was a study done. I'm not sure how well the study was done, just looking at the schools. And
So it wasn't a CAPRI report study then?
It wasn't a
CAPRI study,
it
since
wasn't
you're
a
not
CAPRI
sure how well
study.
it was done.
No, it was a study as part of an academic exercise that somebody did. I was looking at the numbers. They're suggesting that a lot of our persons in prisons come from only a few schools. And those schools have some feeder schools. So if you're talking about 10 to 15 schools that are the major producers of people who are getting into violence and violent crime, and then they have probably 5 schools each going into them, that's what, 60 schools or so, that need not a small intervention, but almost a 360-degree total transformation and investment in those schools. You don't want to spread the butter so thin that nobody gets butter. Those schools require it. And even within the school, there are some people who require that support much more. Because if they don't get it, you're almost guaranteed that they're going to go and become a law enforcement problem later on. So that is what we're talking about. That kind of, not just a thing, not just do a thing, but completely invest in that system of education around those few schools.
And again, it rests upon doing the research, collecting the evidence so to discover what you have just pointed out,
yes,
that a large percentage of prisoners come from particular schools. So it really shows the importance of gathering the data. Again, we have, well, I wouldn't want to call it a challenge to our evidence, but it's an appropriate question that Therese would like to ask. Therese, if you prefer, Turner-Jones. Perhaps these questions are coming from the live stream, so let me ask it on her behalf. What is the evidence of the splintering about which we have built, which we have constructed our entire analysis?
I think I had put it in perspective earlier, which is that we have seen a rise in the gang numbers. And it's not necessary, I mean, unfortunately, there's some information that was shared with me that I can't necessarily share back with the public because it was shared with me on the condition that it doesn't get put in the report and, you know, names and everything has to remain anonymous. But in the process of doing the research, we came across, and you know what, I'll actually use a gang that is, the information is there. So I'm going to take the Klansman gang, for example, which is well known. You have the Telsha Miller faction, and you have the Andre Bryan faction. And the gang itself splintered or went into two separate entities because there was a vie for the power, right? But this is not the case with just the Klansman gang. It is the case with a number of the gangs that exist in Jamaica. And I'm using the Klansman because it's the most public one, and some of the others I can't really discuss. But the reality is that, as I said, resources are more scarce. There are power vacuums that are left when gang leaders are taken out. There are more guns available readily. And the reality is that that kind of boiling pot, so to speak, puts us in a situation where individuals will challenge for gang leadership because they're in a position to do so. As was mentioned earlier, at one point, it was the gang leaders themselves who control the firearms. Now, anybody can get the firearm. So somebody might step out of the gang and do something that was not sanctioned by the gang, or one or two gang members step out of the gang and do something that was not sanctioned. And so you kind of have this split between the gang members as to whether or not it's okay to do whatever they want or make money on the side, whether for a contract killing or something. The reality is that there's a lot more independence that the lower level gang members or even higher ranking, there is a split in the power vacuum that is happening that people want to take hold of, and they're in a position to take the hold because they're armed with the guns. And so they feel empowered. The fact that they have ready access to these weapons, which they never necessarily have access to before in previous years, they now have access to the means of establishing their dominance or challenging leadership of the hierarchy of the gangs.
So we have a car that is blocking access. If you are the owner of a gray Nissan March 4681HR, you will have to remove it. Gray Nissan March.
On what Joanna has said.
Oh, I thought it was your gray Nissan March. No, okay.
I'm a civil servant. I can't afford those things. I'm on wage freeze. Perhaps CAPRI can do something to get me a nice car. So, again, I don't have any empirical evidence. So I am just basically going by my experiences as a prosecutor. So the police investigate, and they bring these files. And when you read the fruits of the police investigation, you will eventually come across a statement by somebody who is giving some kind of background as to why this murder or this shooting took place. And they will say something like, when so-and-so was here or in charge, these things could not happen. Those boys used to hold their corner. But ever since him dead or him gone to prison, everything get out of control. I have seen it in a whole lot of statements on files that have come to our office to be prosecuted. Again, it is not empirical evidence. But to me, it is also a sign of splintering taking place. And some of that I have seen again in files coming out of the Kingston West Division.
Commissioner.
I mean, we see splintering. There was Stone Crusher splintered into a lot of pebbles after it was I mean, there are some roads where the top and bottom part of the road is two gangs now that used to be homogeneous. It's actually obvious when you're out there, and we have names of these people. We know essentially who are associated with them. Some are, as you say, looser, but there's another phenomenon. You have some people who are not so much associated with the gang, but they're guns for hire, and they move around, and people will do other people's work for them. So that they can, and I think that's what Jeremy was saying about the Eugene Wilson gang. How they moved. They had access to resources, persons who will do work for them, and they pay, and it's done. And we see some of our homicides playing out as that sort of thing. So, of course, from a law enforcement perspective, the person who is doing it has no association with the victim. So already it starts to create space between that. So unless you can link them through some scientific means or some statement that you get, there's really no reason to look at that person with that particular crime, and so that creates its own challenges.
Illustration that the commissioner used in relation to Uchense Wilson. With Uchense Wilson, the highly mobile tactic of this particular criminal organization was such. They were swift. They had spotters in each parish as to who was the target. They went in. They would scope out the target for this. They would come into the parish, and for a week, they would stay in the parish, and they would observe the movements of their target. They would attack. They were usually masked. So what happened was that you generated a whole lot of cold cases. Investigation reached a certain point, and it buck. It cannot go any further. Until we got a lead in relation to some cooperating witness. And it opened a whole plethora of crimes were immediately solved based on what these cooperating witnesses said. So we knew now that particular event in Trelawney, what happened, this one in St. Anne, what happened, that one in St. Mary, what happened, this in St. Catherine, what happened, Kingston and St. Andrew, what happened on those dates, and and by the way, those are the 7 parishes, and Clarendon knew what happened. So a lot of those cases were immediately cleared up just by 2 people coming forward.
Commissioner.
I know, saying, which means that even within the correctional system, we have to now look at provisions for people who are in the system and want to become witnesses. One, how we protect them, isolate them. Also, what arrangements are made around things like reduced sentences for being part of that. So this again is new ground.
It is new ground.
It's a response. The fact is that with all of that, they actually are in jail at the moment. So that's a good sign that they are actually in jail. And there are, as you say, there are more to follow. But it's a responsiveness to this evolution. We have to respond to it very quickly. We don't have space and start to deal with some of these new challenges in terms of...
If I may, just the last time, if I may, based on how both the police prosecution partnership has evolved, I think we have managed to make an inroad into being able to bring many of these criminal organizations to trial. Because the truth is, law-abiding people don't get mixed up with criminal organizations. You will not be able to take down a criminal organization if you're going to rely entirely on law-abiding people, unless they're a victim who has been attacked by 3 or more people, and that's the most basic criminal organization under the law. So we have actually found a way, using the whole thing of plea negotiations, to make inroads. So what we have found now is that there are some persons who are willing to come forward, and it might sound cynical, but yes, they have to get a benefit from coming forward. And this is the way how we have managed to make inroads and bring people to be prosecuted.
Yeah, go ahead, Joanna.
Witness protection and the use of persons from within organizations as witnesses is a very accepted and practiced method of bringing down gangs and organizations within other countries. So having that ability, and it's something that we do need to develop, being able to reduce sentences if a person is willing to give us the inner workings of an organization, able to close 10, 15 cases that are open, pending, and families still don't know what may not have happened if they're victims. It is something that needs to be expanded and invested in.
What strikes me, listening to the presentations, listening to the discussion, the feeling that I'm getting, and I dare say you're probably getting it as well, is a coherence, a consensus about what the problem is and how it is showing up. That there's not a whole lot of disagreement up here. And so I hope, are getting a sense of the nature of the problem we have that is manifesting itself as a shooting there and a murder here and the violence that we see. So if we have this common understanding, why is it violence is not declining? If we have this understanding of the problem, what is the constraint? What is the obstacle? And so I'm going to ask each of the panelists in their 2-minute wrap-up to answer that question. What is the binding constraint, the way we seem to commonly see the problem that we have? What is the thing that needs to be done, or what is it you need to have put in place so that we can actually see crime and violence declining consistent with our understanding of the problem? I'm going to start with you, Jeremy.
Well, again, that's a very difficult question to answer. I tend to look at my role simplistically. I exist to put people in jail, not to solve social problems. But if you look at Jamaica as a whole, Jamaica has always been a violent society. From the Spaniards came here, 307 years of British misrule, sorry, Diffid, in which they abuse us. So there's a sense in which violence is cultural, and we mediate our social discourses through violence. For example, if you pick up a newspaper, how do you see the headlines? Somebody knock somebody, somebody lash somebody, somebody whip somebody, somebody blast somebody. We mediate our national discourse through the language of violence. We're strong on corporal punishment. When Machete Mary was beating her daughter in that infamous video, the amount of people who defended her rather than condemned her also shows that violence is also cultural, and we raise our children with it. There may have to be, and it may seem impractical from social science empirical point of view, there may need to be some kind of moral and values revolution in this country. You know, right and wrong, and raising people with the proper ways without a resort to either violence of language or violence of physical violence. That's the only way I can see it.
I know I gave you only 2 minutes, but I'd just like to ask if you wanted to put legislation as part of your answer to what is the binding constraint.
Boy, you know, I'm going to tell you, I don't know if the law can legislate that people must like each other. You know, I don't know if the law can say I must love my neighbor.
But the law can make your job easier.
But the law already exists to make my job easier. If I was to hold and batter Miss Cullen, depending on the nature of her injuries, I either go to jail for life or I go to jail for 3 years. There's no need
and you
for
would
any
incur the
greater
wrath
penalties.
Of CAPRI.
Pardon me?
You would incur the wrath of the entire CAPRI staff.
You may even do a study on me. So the law already exists. The penalties in law already exist. There's really no need to add to it, which is why I'm saying I can't really say as a prosecutor what must be done. It is Miss Magnus who really is the person who I think would perhaps have the better answers rather than me at the DPP.
So just to highlight that this is a disagreement with one of CAPRI's recommendations in relation to legislative gaps. So it's something for us to think about as we move forward to a better understanding. Kelly, can you tell us what you see as the binding constraint?
Rather than a constraint, I'll point to 2 opportunities. One, I think, is the immediate provision of monitoring and evaluation training for all civil society and state agencies working in violence prevention. We can't fix a problem if we don't know how to measure it. And we are not measuring the interventions consistently, and there is no overarching framework. So that, I think, ought to be a priority. The second opportunity that I think is really exciting is the Prime Minister's creation of a National Commission on Violence Prevention. I think is a really unique opportunity to have that both long-term and integrated thinking. I think too often we try to find solutions to the problems of violence in the short term, and it's not realistic. And what the Prime Minister has asked for is a 10-year strategy on violence prevention, including recommendations to legislation, program design, budgets, that I think has, creates an opportunity for the kind of thinking to be brought before that commission into an integrated plan.
We had asked at the beginning of the session, has violence touched your life directly? And just updating, since we have more responses now, that more than a third of persons can say that gang-related violence has affected them. Not even just violence, gang-related violence. And I think this is support for the view expressed by a number of our panelists that gangs should be the focus of Jamaica's security efforts. Joanna.
So I ended my presentation with a number, 19,348. The number of injuries, intentional acts of violence that were treated in hospitals across Jamaica. And those are the ones that were reported, or dealt with rather. Because I know there are several instances where the violence is experienced and it doesn't even go for treatment at the hospitals. I agree with Jeremy in that what we have is a sociocultural problem that goes beyond legislation. Now, there are two aspects of addressing crime. There's crime prevention and there's crime control. Underneath crime prevention, we have to have programs that address the deep-seated cultural acceptance and normalization of violence in our society. We accept violence as a norm of resolving issues. When we create those programs, I agree with Kelly, we need to have proper monitoring and evaluation. So if it means training those persons who engage with the community members, then it needs to be done. It should be a requirement. The documentation of these programs is also an issue. We did not arrive in our situation last year, 5 years ago, or even 10 years ago. This has been a systemic problem for decades. If it is that we're going to solve the problem, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time. We need to make sure that our interventions are sustainable, well documented, and measurable, evaluated, so we know which programs need to be repeated in the long run to change said behavior. We need crime control as well. The reality is that you will have people who will never conform to societal norms. We have to have a system in place that addresses the issues for crime control. So the trafficking of guns, there's a study out of Geneva that estimates that Jamaica has some 200,000 illegal guns in Jamaica. That is a ridiculous number. As the commissioner and Mr. Taylor said, everybody has their own gun on the corner now. Crime control measures are a necessity. A police organization to address and to carry out those crime control interventions are a necessity. So there are two sides to the story for the whole thing. So I think we need crime prevention, crime control, right across the board.
The question to our panelists, to remind you, is given what has emerged as a consensus understanding of the nature of the security problem that Jamaica faces, then why isn't crime going down? What is the constraint? What is the obstacle? Commissioner, to you more than anyone else.
Okay, so...
and you can tell us if you need more money.
So based on I agree with most of what has been said so far. Certainly, we get an opportunity to see violence in a way that nobody, I don't think any other collective group sees as much or as often as we do, or the results of it. And so when we see 3 people being killed in a day because of some yam in the back of a yard, it kind of suggests something that's not, it wasn't necessarily a gang activity, but it probably surrounded some, not so much the yam, but some disrespect or some gang association and so on, because they're being killed by illegal firearms. So in terms of legislation, certainly if you're going to pull apart criminal organizations, it needs to be easier to get to their money. And that is one of the recommendations you made. But there are some challenges doing that. And we had a little sidebar with Jeremy earlier. There are some challenges with doing it. So we're glad to hear it from you, from civil society, from CAPRI, as research-based information that you actually need to get to their money. In terms of course, illegal firearms, I just happened to mention trafficking, but there are a number of pieces of offenses under that legislation that are not there, that should be there as it relates to our illegal gun activities in Jamaica. Now, I don't know if it's 200,000, but we know it's a lot. And so our legislation needs to reflect that and how we're doing crime control with respect to that. One thing that wasn't mentioned, and we're talking about gangs, is what happens after they go through the court system and end up in custody. I don't think you can have a proper discussion around this without having a correctional system and facilities that can adequately rehabilitate people. If you don't do that, you're going to get them back worse than you sent them in. And the prison population largely changes every 3-point-something years. It's about 1,000, they're about just under 4,000, I think. In there, it fluctuates, 3,000 plus to 4,000, and just over 1,000 leave a year, which means that you have about the time it takes to get a degree inside, and you're going to get a degree in something. Now, we have control of the people at that point. We can make sure they get learning to become better citizens when they come out. Because 3 years, like it or not, they'll be back with us. So we have an opportunity, or we're creating our own circumstances and our own demise. So that, I just wanted to add that back-end piece. What are we going to do about it? Why is it going up? Because a lot of the things we're speaking about is an evolution of things. Things are changing, and we are responding. The fact of the matter is, a lot of the technologies that we are just acquiring and just putting in place are those technologies that are going to allow us to deal with things like the mobility and communications and behaviors of gangs from a law enforcement perspective. And so just seeing what is being put in place, the consensus here, because I talk to Kelly all the time, and their monitoring and evaluation framework is it. This is what we need to do. We have these discussions. So we see as one of our direct, as the police, one of our direct strategies of dealing with it is engagement, is stakeholder engagement and working with other groups. Then we have our law enforcement strategy, and then we have our transformational activities, and all of them are moving along. So we should see better results in the future.
Thank you. CAPRI is able to help to create a discussion, to provide knowledge and understanding to policymaking. This is what you are seeing here. And we also often meet with the Minister of National Security to discuss our findings. The way public financing goes in Jamaica, it is not easy for the Jamaica Constabulary to pay for this, or the Ministry of National Security. And so this forum and the work that CAPRI does depends critically on people who are willing to provide the sponsorship, people who are willing to underwrite the kind of research to bring evidence to bear. So we are deeply grateful, not just CAPRI when I say we, but I think as a society, I think we should be grateful to those who provide that sponsorship. This entire field of research for CAPRI was in partnership with the United Kingdom Department for International Development, and we're extremely grateful to their support for what we have done. And I want to give them a round of applause. But that funded the research. We still need to pay rent and pay staff and pay the bills. And that ongoing funding is actually covered by members of Jamaica's private sector. CAPRI is funded with money untied to any particular research project, just so we can have the capacity in place to address these issues. And some of our Gold Circle sponsors are here today, and so I want to express my appreciation to them. JMMB, National Baking, Guardsman, and Panjam, amongst about a dozen other leading Jamaican private sector companies. I would like to thank our panelists for contributing to the discussion and helping us to have a better understanding. CAPRI's report is hereby launched. It is on CAPRI's website, so you can have access to it. And a summary of all the reports that we have done under this umbrella, Transforming Citizen Security a Yard, has been distributed to you. There are refreshments outside. Thank you very much.